There are moments in life when you just know you've stepped into something strange. It's not always obvious at first. Sometimes it creeps up on you slowly, like the chill in the air when the sun sets. That's exactly how it felt the night I walked through the gates of Disneyland for my first shift as a security guard. It wasn't the job I dreamed of, but it paid well, and after months of searching, I wasn't in a position to be picky. The gig came with a catch, though. My assignment wasn't in the main part of the park. No bright lights, no cheerful music, no excited tourists clutching Mickey Mouse ears. I was hired to patrol an area I'd never heard of before, Zone 13. The name alone gave me a weird feeling. Zone 13. It sounded more like something out of a sci-fi movie than part of the happiest place on Earth. But I figured it was just some behind-the-scenes section, maybe where they stored old ride equipment or something. I told myself not to overthink it. When I arrived at the security office that night, I expected some kind of orientation, maybe a tour of the park. What I got instead was a man named Mr. Fernandez. "Daniel Harper?" he asked, barely glancing up from the clipboard in his hands. "That's me," I said, trying to sound confident. Fernandez was tall and lean, with sharp features and a face that didn't seem capable of smiling. He wore a dark suit that looked way too formal for Disneyland, and his eyes were hidden behind a pair of tinted glasses, even though we were indoors. "You'll be patrolling Zone 13, he said, his voice as flat and cold as his expression. "Follow me." He didn't wait for a response. I hurried to keep up as he led me through a series of dimly lit hallways. The further we went, the quieter it got. I could still hear the distant sounds of the park, laughter, music, the whoosh of a roller coaster, but it felt far away, like it belonged to another world. We stopped in front of a heavy metal door with a faded sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." Fernandez pulled a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and gestured for me to step inside. "Welcome to Zone 13, he said. I walked through the door, and immediately felt like I'd stepped back in time. The air was stale, like it hadn't been circulated in years. The walls were lined with old posters advertising rides I'd never heard of, and the floor was covered in scuffed linoleum tiles that might have been white once, but had faded to a sickly yellow. In the distance, I could see the outlines of abandoned attractions, a carousel with chipped paint, a roller coaster that looked like it hadn't run in decades, and a row of animatronic animals frozen in mid-performance. "Is this part of the park?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie silence. Fernandez didn't answer right away. He walked over to a small desk near the entrance and picked up a piece of paper. "These are the rules," he said, handing it to me. I glanced at the list, expecting the usual stuff. No smoking, no running, keep your radio on. Instead, I found a list of rules that made no sense at all. 1. Never stay in Zone 13 after midnight. 2. Do not look the animatronics in the eyes. 3. If you hear someone whisper your name, do not answer. 4. Always carry your flashlight. The batteries drain quickly here. 5. If you see a door marked, do not enter, do not enter. "What is this?" I asked, frowning. Fernandez finally took off his glasses and looked me in the eye. His gaze was cold and serious, and for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of fear. "This is not a normal job," he said quietly. "You follow these rules, and you'll be fine. Break them, and—" He paused, like he was searching for the right words. "Well, let's just say you don't want to find out what happens." I laughed nervously, waiting for him to tell me he was kidding. He didn't. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Very." I stared at the list again, my mind racing. Maybe this was some kind of initiation prank. Or maybe the guys who work here had too much time on their hands and came up with these rules to mess with a new guy. Before I could say anything else, Fernandez leaned in a little closer. "Do your job, Daniel," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And don't ask questions." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the middle of Zone 13. As I stood there, clutching the list of rules, I had the distinct feeling that I just stepped into something I wasn't ready for. Something dark, something dangerous. But it was too late to back out now. The night stretched out in front of me, dark and endless, as I began my first patrol around Zone 13. The quiet was unnerving. Even Disneyland, a place usually bursting with laughter and music, seemed to fall completely silent in this part of the park. It was as if Zone 13 had been forgotten by the world. My footsteps echoed on the concrete as I walked past empty rides and lifeless animatronics. Their painted eyes stared out blankly, chipped and faded with age. Some of them looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, but even that felt distant, like a sound coming from the other end of a long, dark tunnel. At first, nothing seemed too strange, other than the creepy atmosphere. I told myself I was just overthinking things. It was my first night on the job, after all. New places are always a little weird at first, right? I kept walking, shining my flashlight into the dark corners of the rides. One of the rides, an old carousel, caught my attention. The horses were frozen mid-leap, their once bright colors faded to a dull gray. As I walked past it, I thought I heard something, a faint clicking sound like gears turning. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just silence. I shook my head and kept walking, feeling a little stupid for getting jumpy so soon. But as I rounded the corner, I noticed someone standing near one of the old ticket booths. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey," I called out, shining my flashlight toward them. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my hand tightening on the flashlight. "You're not supposed to be here," I said. When I got close enough to see clearly, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was one of the animatronics, a tall, lanky figure dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it were listening to something. I let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, that's enough to give anyone a heart attack," I muttered, brushing past it. As I walked away, I swear I heard something, a soft whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. "Daniel." I froze. My skin prickled, and my mouth went dry. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight back at the animatronic. It hadn't moved, but something about it felt different now. Its blank, glassy eyes seemed to be looking right at me. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Daniel." The whisper came again, faint and distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the park. I swallowed hard and turned away. It was just my imagination. It had to be. Maybe the wind had caught the wires, or maybe I was just hearing things because I was tired. As I continued my patrol, the whisper stayed with me, echoing in my mind. I tried to focus on my route, checking the doors and gates like I was supposed to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I passed by the carousel again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the horses had turned its head. I stared at it, trying to convince myself that it had always been like that I just hadn't noticed it before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The horse's painted eyes seemed to follow me as I backed away. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to keep walking, one step at a time, until I was out of sight. By the time I reached the security office at the end of my shift, my nerves were completely shot. I sat down heavily in the chair and rubbed my face, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed Kyle sitting at the desk across from me. He was an older guy, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He'd been working at Disneyland for years, and he had the kind of weary look that told me he'd seen all. "First night, huh?" he said, giving me a knowing look. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's a little creepy out there." Kyle chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You'll get used to it," he said. "Or you won't." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Zone 13 isn't like the rest of the park," he said. "There's a reason we have those rules. You follow them, you stay safe. You break them, well, let's just say you don't want to find out what happens." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Has anyone ever broken the rules?" I asked. Kyle didn't answer right away. He just stared at me for a long moment, his expression grim. "Just do your job and keep your head down," he said finally. "And whatever you do, if you hear someone whisper your name, don't answer." He stood up and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there in the silence, replaying his words over and over in my mind. Don't answer. As I clocked out and left the park, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I did. The list was crumpled in my hand, the edges soft from where I'd folded it and unfolded it too many times. I stared at it again, even though by now I knew every rule by heart. 1. Never stay after midnight. 2. Don't look the animatronics in the eyes. 3. If you hear someone whisper your name, don't answer. It was so ridiculous. I mean, who comes up with this stuff? But every time I laughed it off, I remember the look on Kyle's face when he told me to take it seriously. That haunted, Jittery looked like he'd seen something he was trying really hard to forget. I shoved the list back into my pocket. It wasn't like I was planning to break any of the rules. Not really. I was just curious. I figure a little curiosity wouldn't hurt anyone. That night, my shift started like usual. The park was quiet, the way it always was after the last visitors had left. Zone 13 felt even darker than usual, though. The air had that heavy, still quality, like right before a thunderstorm. I started my rounds, walking past the old rides and animatronics. The rides hadn't moved in years, and the animatronics were frozen in place, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the distance. Most of them, anyway. I stopped in front of the old carousel. It was covered in dust, and the paint on the horses was chipped and faded. But that wasn't what caught my attention. One of the horses had its head turned slightly, just enough that it seemed to be looking right at me. I stepped closer, squinting at it. No way. It had to be my imagination. Or maybe it had always been turned like that, and I just hadn't noticed before. A shiver ran down my spine, and I forced myself to keep walking. At exactly 11:55 p.m., I made my decision. I was going to stay past midnight, just for a few minutes, just to see what would happen. I found a bench near the old Ferris wheel and sat down. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a stupid rule, probably designed to scare new employees. Midnight came and went, and nothing happened. No ghosts, no monsters, no evil animatronics. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and leaned back on the bench. See, I said out loud, my voice echoing in the empty park. Nothing to be scared of. That's when I heard it. A soft, lilting melody drifting through the air. It sounded like one of those old Disney songs, the kind they used to play in the park back in the 50s. But it was distorted, like it was coming from a broken speaker. I stood up, looking around. The music seemed to be coming from the carousel. I took a step closer, and the music got louder. The lights on the carousel flickered once, then again. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The carousel hadn't worked in years. Fernandez had told me that on my first day. I should have walked away. I should have turned around and gone straight back to the security office. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped onto the platform. The floor creaked under my weight, and the carousel lights flickered again. I reached out and touched one of the horses. The paint felt cold and rough under my fingers. The music stopped. I froze, my hand still on the horse's neck. The silence was deafening. My ears strained to catch any sound, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, loud and ragged in the stillness. And then, slowly, the horse's head turned to face me. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. No, that wasn't possible. The animatronics didn't move. They couldn't move. I turned to run, but as I did, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. One of the other animatronics, a giant, grinning bear, was standing in the middle of the path. I hadn't even heard it move. Its eyes were glowing red. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I took off, sprinting down the path as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard the sound of heavy, shuffling footsteps, and then the distorted Disney music started up again, louder and more frantic than before. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. For a long time, I just stood there, trying to catch my breath. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 12:07 a.m. I had stayed after midnight, and now, I had a feeling the rules weren't just rules. They were warnings. I couldn't shake the feeling that Zone 13 was hiding something. Every shift brought more questions, and the uneasy silence of the place seemed to press down on me harder with each passing night. I'd only been working here for a week, but already, I felt like I was losing track of time. Days blended together, and at night, I found myself lying awake, hearing the phantom sounds of whirring gears and distant laughter, long after I'd left the park. Fernandez's rules were messing with my head. Don't stay after midnight. Don't look the animatronics in the eyes. Don't answer if you hear someone whisper your name. What the hell kind of workplace even needed rules like that? It wasn't just weird, it was wrong. And the worst part was, nobody would explain why. That night, I decided to find out for myself. I waited until my break, then slipped down a narrow corridor near the back of Zone 13. It was a part of the park that didn't show up on any of the maps. There were no colorful signs or cheerful music here, just concrete walls, flickering lights, and the faint smell of dust and oil. I'd seen Fernandez disappear down this hallway a few times, and my gut told me there had to be something important back here. At the end of the corridor, I found a heavy metal door with a rusted lock. I tugged at it, half expecting it to be sealed shut, but to my surprise, it creaked open with a groan that echoed down the hall. Inside was what looked like an old storage room. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with dusty boxes, broken animatronic parts, and faded memorabilia from a time when Disneyland looked very different. There were old photographs, yellowed with age, showing smiling families posing in front of rides that didn't exist anymore. But it wasn't the photos that caught my attention. It was the file cabinet in the corner. I pulled open the top drawer, and a musty smell hit me like a punch to the face. Inside were thick manila folders, each labeled with neat, blocky handwriting. Some of them had names I didn't recognize, but one stood out immediately. Zone 13 incident reports. My heart started pounding. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting Fernandez to appear out of nowhere, but the hallway was empty. I grabbed the folder and flipped it open. The first report was dated 1974. It described an accident involving one of the animatronics, a life-size bear that had been part of a ride called the Forest Trail. According to the report, the bear had malfunctioned during a test run, jerking violently and nearly crushing one of the technicians. The ride was shut down, and the animatronic was decommissioned. But instead of being dismantled, it had been moved to storage. I kept reading, and the reports got worse. There were incidents involving other animatronics, an old pirate captain, a grinning clown, a mechanical bird with glowing red eyes. In every case, the animatronics had been removed from their rides after behaving strangely. Some of them twitched and moved when they weren't supposed to. Others made sounds that weren't part of their programming. One report mentioned an animatronic doll that kept turning its head to stare at people, even when it was unplugged. By the time I reached the last report, my hand was shaking. The final entry was dated 1983, and it was different from the others. There was no description of an accident or malfunction, just a single line, scrawled in red ink across the page. Zone 13 closed indefinitely. Do not attempt to access. Below it was a signature. Mr. Fernandez. I stared at the name, my mind racing. How could Fernandez have signed a report from 1983? He didn't look like he'd aged a day past 50. If he'd been working here back then, he'd have to be, in his 90s? I shoved the folder back into the drawer and slammed it shut. My breathing was ragged, and my skin felt clammy. Suddenly, the air in the room felt too thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I had to get out. As I turned to leave, something on one of the shelves caught my eye. It was an old photograph, propped up against a stack of books. I picked it up and brushed off the layer of dust. The picture showed a group of Disneyland employees standing in front of one of the old rides. They were all smiling, except for one man in the back. He was wearing a dark suit and tinted glasses, and his expression was unreadable. Even though the photo had to be at least 40 years old, I recognized him instantly. It was Fernandez, and he looked exactly the same as he did today. A chill ran down my spine, and I shoved the photo back on the shelf. I didn't want to be in that room any longer. I needed answers, but I wasn't going to find them here. As I stepped back into the hallway, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper like someone saying my name. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Daniel. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I knew the rule. Don't answer if you hear someone whisper your name. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to keep walking, one step at a time. Don't stop. Don't turn around. Daniel. The voice was closer now, right behind me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, but I kept moving. I didn't breathe again until I was back in the main corridor, where the lights were brighter, and the air didn't feel so suffocating. I needed to talk to Fernandez. Whatever was going on in Zone 13, he knew the truth, and I was going to find out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with Zone 13. The whispers, the strange rules, the way the animatronics seemed to watch me. It was all clawing at the back of my mind. The worst part was Mr. Fernandez. There was something off about him, something I couldn't put my finger on. He knew more than he was telling me, and I was determined to find out what. The next night, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to keep wandering through that creepy part of the park without answers. After finishing my first round of patrols, I headed to Fernandez's office. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out into the dim hallway. I knocked twice. "Come in, Daniel," his deep voice called before I even had a chance to open the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. How did he know it was me? Pushing the thought aside, I stepped inside. Fernandez sat behind his desk, as calm as ever, his dark suit impeccable, not a single hair out of place. He didn't look up right away. Instead, he kept scribbling something on a yellowed piece of paper with an old-fashioned fountain pen. "Have a seat," he said without looking up. I sat down in the chair across from him, feeling like I was back in the principal's office. The air in the room was cold, colder than it should have been. He finally set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His eyes, hidden behind those ever-present tinted glasses, seemed to pierce right through me. "What can I do for you, Daniel?" he asked, his voice smooth and polite, but there was an edge to it, like a warning. I swallowed hard, suddenly unsure how to start. But I'd come this far. No turning back now. "I need to know what's really going on here," I said. "Zone 13, the rules, the animatronics. Where are you hiding?" Fernandez tilted his head slightly, as if he were considering how to answer. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched out between us, heavy and suffocating. "Some things," he said finally, "are better left alone." "That's not an answer," I shot back, surprising even myself with how bold I sounded. "You tell us to follow these weird rules, but you won't say why. People are disappearing, Fernandez. Something's not right, and I think you know exactly what it is." His lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been curious. That's dangerous, Daniel." "Dangerous how?" I leaned forward, my palms sweating. "You keep warning me, but you won't explain anything. I deserve to know the truth." He sighed, a long, weary sound, like he was carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets. For the first time, he looked tired. "Do you really want to know?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to say no. Fernandez leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Zone 13 is not like the rest of the park," he said. "It was shut down years ago, after an incident." "What kind of incident?" He hesitated, then said, "An accident. At least, that's what the official report said. But it wasn't an accident, Daniel. It was something much worse." I waited, heart pounding, as he continued. "The animatronics in Zone 13 were part of an experimental project. They were supposed to be more advanced, more lifelike. But something went wrong. They started acting strange, moving on their own, saying things they weren't programmed to say." A chill ran down my spine. "You're telling me they're alive?" "Not alive," Fernandez said. "But not dead, either. Something happened to them, something we still don't fully understand. And that's why we have the rules. The rules are the only thing keeping them in check." I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around what he was saying. It sounded impossible, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. I'd seen the way the animatronics moved when they thought no one was watching. I'd heard the whispers. "What happens if someone breaks the rules?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Fernandez's expression darkened. "Bad things, Daniel. Very bad things. The rules are there for a reason. They're the only thing keeping the curse contained." "Curse?" I repeated, my mouth dry. Fernandez nodded. "Zone 13 is cursed, Daniel. And every time someone breaks the rules, the curse grows stronger." I stared at him, my mind racing. A curse. Animatronics that weren't alive, but weren't dead. Rules that had to be followed to keep the curse in check. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. "What about you?" I asked suddenly. "How long have you been here?" I saw an old photo from the 70s. You were in it. You haven't aged a day. For the first time, Fernandez looked uncomfortable. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "That is a story for another time," he said. "Right now, you need to focus on staying alive. Follow the rules, Daniel. No more questions. No more curiosity. Just do your job, and maybe you'll make it out of here in one piece." He stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I took the hint and got to my feet, my legs feeling shaky. As I turned to leave, Fernandez spoke one last time. "Be careful, Daniel. Zone 13 has a way of Changing people. Don't let it change you. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked out of the office, my mind spinning. I had come looking for answers, and I'd found them. But now that I knew the truth, I almost wished I didn't. Because one thing was clear. Zone 13 was far more dangerous than I ever could have imagined. I glanced at my watch. Midnight. I was supposed to clock out 10 minutes ago, but something had kept me here. Maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity, or maybe a little bit of both. The rule was clear: never stay after midnight. But the park was so quiet, so still, that it felt harmless. Besides, what could really happen? Was someone going to jump out and scare me? Was one of those old, dusty animatronics going to sing me a lullaby and tell me to go home? I laughed softly to myself as I locked up the last section of Zone 13. The laughter didn't last long. As I turned to head back toward the security office, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out completely. The darkness was immediate and overwhelming. My flashlight barely cut through it, casting shaky beams against the walls. I cursed under my breath and fumbled with my walkie-talkie, but all I got was static. That's when I heard it. A low, warbling tune drifting through the air, like it was coming from a broken music box. It sounded familiar, too familiar. I recognized it as the melody from one of the old rides in Zone 13, a ride that had been shut down years ago. The ride wasn't supposed to be working. A chill ran down my spine. I kept walking, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling building in my chest. I was probably imagining things. Maybe someone had forgotten to turn off the ride's audio system. That had to be it. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps coming from behind me. I froze. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight down the long, empty hallway. Nothing. No one. Just shadows stretching across the floor like long, crooked fingers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and unsure. Silence. I turned back around and picked up my pace. My boots echoed against the tile floor, but I could still hear those footsteps, closer now, matching my every step. "Don't panic," I told myself. "Just get out. Follow the rules. You're not supposed to be here." But I'd already broken the most important rule, hadn't I? I'd stayed after midnight. I was halfway to the exit when I saw it. One of the animatronics, a bear with faded fur and lifeless glass eyes, was standing in the middle of the hallway. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its mouth was slightly open, as if it was caught mid-song. I took a shaky step backward. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw the bear's eyes move, tracking me. No, that wasn't possible. It was just an old, malfunctioning machine. It couldn't move on its own, right? I swallowed hard and took another step back. The bear didn't move. It just stood there, grinning at me with that empty, painted-on smile. I turned and started walking faster, then running. The music was louder now, warped and distorted, like it was being played underwater. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to see if the bear was following me. But I didn't have to look. I could hear it. The soft, mechanical whirring of its joints, the scrape of its claws against the floor. It was coming for me. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The exit was just ahead. I could see the door, the glowing red exit sign. Almost there. Just a few more steps. Then, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut. I skidded to a stop, gasping for breath. My flashlight flickered again and went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. I could hear them now. Not just the bear, but the others. The animatronics. Their footsteps echoed all around me, coming from every direction. A voice whispered my name. Daniel. It was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a bolt of terror through me. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my breathing steady. Don't answer. That was one of the rules. If you hear someone whisper your name, don't answer. But the voice kept calling, closer now, right behind me. Daniel. I squeezed my eyes shut and covered my ears, trying to block it out. But it was inside my head, wrapping around my thoughts like cold, sticky tendrils. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, swinging my flashlight like a weapon. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the bear. It was standing right in front of me, its glassy eyes glowing faintly in the dark. its mouth open wider, and for a moment, I thought it was going to speak. Instead, it started singing. Its voice was scratchy and broken, like an old record player, but I could still make out the words. It's a small world after all. It's a small world after all. The song twisted and warped, becoming something darker, something wrong. I backed away, but the bear followed, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled and fell, my back hitting the cold tile floor. The bear loomed over me, its mouth still moving, still singing. I could see wires sticking out of its neck, sparks flickering behind its eyes. And then, just when I thought it was going to rip me apart, a voice cut through the darkness. Enough! The bear froze. I looked up and saw Mr. Fernandez standing at the end of the hallway, his face expressionless, his eyes hidden behind those tinted glasses. "Get up, Daniel," he said calmly. "We need to talk. I don't know how long I've been running, but my breath feels like fire in my chest. The stuttering clanks and screeches of the animatronics follow me, relentless, like something straight out of a nightmare. I hear their metal limbs grinding against the cracked floor, their haunting mechanical laughter bouncing off the walls of Zone 13. The sound of their movements is maddening, the way they move without any grace, yet so perfectly in sync, it's like they're hunting me, deliberately. The dark hallway stretches on forever. Each step I take swallowed up by the oppressive silence that fills the spaces between their sounds. My heart is hammering in my ears, louder than the footsteps of the animatronics, but I can't stop running. If I do, if I slow down even for a second, I know they'll catch me. I know it. Suddenly, the hallway seems to warp, the lights flickering once, twice, then they go out completely. The blackness feels suffocating, like it's trying to choke the air from my lungs. I stop dead in my tracks, straining my eyes to see anything, but it's hopeless. Then I hear it, a deep, gravelly voice cutting through the silence, low and almost a whisper, but unmistakably there. "Daniel." I freeze. I know that voice. It's Fernandez. I'm not sure how he's here, but I don't care. I turn around, desperate to find him, to understand what's happening. And just as suddenly as the darkness hit, the lights flicker back to life. And there he is, Fernandez, standing at the end of the corridor, his tall figure outlined against the dim light. He's wearing his usual dark suit, the same tinted glasses obscuring his eyes. But now there's something different in the air around him, something unnatural. A heavy presence, a weight pressing down on me. "You've broken all the rules, Daniel," he says, his voice carrying an edge I haven't heard before. It's not anger, but something colder, more final. I'm breathing heavily, still trying to catch my breath, but the fear is creeping in, growing, thickening in my chest. What's happening? What is this place? What are they? Why are they after me? Fernandez's lips curl into a thin smile, but there's no warmth in it. It's the kind of smile a person gives when they know something you don't, and they're not about to tell you. But his voice is steady as he speaks, like he's been saying these words for years, as if they were rehearsed. "You've stepped into something far darker than you realize," he begins, his gaze never leaving mine. "Zone 13 was shut down decades ago after an accident. Something happened here, something no one could control. The animatronics, the park's creations, were never meant to be anything more than machines, but they became something else." I can feel a chill crawl on my spine, my gut twisting with the weight of his words. "What happened? What do you mean something else?" Fernandez steps forward, slowly, his presence filling the hallway like an oppressive shadow. I can't back away. There's nowhere to go. I want to scream, to run, but something keeps me rooted to the spot, like I'm paralyzed by the truth he's about to drop on me. "They're cursed, Daniel. Every rule you've been told to follow. They're not just rules, they're protections. The animatronics, they're not just machines anymore. They're vessels. Vessels for something darker. Something ancient that was unleashed when they were created." I can barely comprehend what he's saying, but somehow I understand. A sick feeling pools in my stomach. "You mean to say the park's cursed? But why? How? What does that have to do with me?" Fernandez exhales sharply, his voice hardening, and for the first time, I see something other than his usual cold demeanor. A flicker of fear in his eyes, something raw and real. "Because, Daniel," he says slowly, you've already become a part of it. By breaking the rules, you've weakened the boundaries that kept the curse in check. The animatronics, the spirits, they're bound to this place, to Zone 13. They can't leave. Not unless. Unless what? I whisper, barely able to force the words past the lump in my throat. Unless you're the one who brings it out. You've done it. You've opened the door. He stops for a moment, his expression hardening again. And now, you have to pay the price. A knot forms in my stomach, and my mind races, trying to make sense of it all. The curse, the animatronics coming to life, the rules. I feel like I've fallen into a trap, one that I didn't even know existed. All this time, I thought it was just some strange, twisted joke. But it wasn't. It was real. You don't have much time left, Daniel. Fernandez continues, his tone turning almost pleading. If you stay, if you don't leave now, you'll become part of it too. Like all the others. The ones who broke the rules and never left. I don't understand what he means by that, but the fear on his face is enough to convince me. The animatronics, the curse, the rules, it's all real. And now it's coming for me. Fernandez, I try to speak, but my voice cracks. What do? How do I stop it? His face darkens. You can't. Not now. The damage is done. All you can do is survive. And then, just like that, he turns away, walking into the darkness, leaving me to face the consequences of everything I've done. I stand there in silence, my heart pounding, unsure of what's to come next. But deep down, I know it's too late to turn back. There's no going home. No way out. I've opened the door, and now the curse has claimed me. And the worst part, I think it's only just beginning. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but my legs were screaming. Sweat drenched my shirt, my heart thudding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I didn't dare look back. The noise behind me, the metallic clank of mechanical limbs, the eerie mechanical hums, was enough to push me forward, faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in Zone 13. Not anymore. I heard a faint crackle from the intercom. Daniel. It was Mr. Fernandez's voice. Cold, calm, and as unsettling as ever. You need to stop. His words, muffled and distant, seemed to echo around me. The lights flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows along the walls of the narrow corridor. I stumbled, nearly falling into the darkness, but somehow, I kept moving. The rules. I thought, maybe I should have listened. But it was too late. I'd already crossed the line, already done too much. And now, everything was coming for me. As I rounded another corner, I saw it. A towering figure, an animatronic, its joints creaking with every step it took. Its eyes, wide, unblinking, locked onto me, glowing with a sickly red light. For a moment, I froze, my breath caught in my throat. But then, a voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. Run, Daniel. Now. It was Fernandez. I didn't question it. I just ran. I turned a corner and skidded to a stop, nearly slamming into the wall. Another animatronic. This one was a clown, its face stretched into a grotesque grin, the kind of smile that looked wrong. It jerked toward me with a sound like a rusty hinge, its eyes darting from side to side as it reached for me. My legs refused to cooperate. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was done for. But then the sound of Fernandez's voice again, stronger this time, booming through the intercom. Get to the back exit. Now, Daniel. I blinked, trying to focus. The back exit. I'd seen it before, but I didn't know how to get there. I needed to get there, though. The animatronics were closing in, and I knew, deep down, I had no other choice. I didn't know what Fernandez meant by the curse, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. With every ounce of energy I had left, I pushed forward, turning and darting through another maze of hallways, desperately searching for the door that could set me free. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, closing in, pulling at my heels. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the entire park itself was alive, trying to trap me in its haunted belly. The ground beneath me felt unstable, like I was running on a ship caught in a storm. Every step I took seemed to sink deeper into the darkness. And then I saw it. The back exit. A heavy steel door, half hidden behind a stack of old ride props. My heart skipped a beat. I was almost there. I could taste the fresh air, the outside world. I was almost free. I reached out for the door, my hand shaking as I touched the cold handle. But before I could pull it open, a sound, a loud, sickening screech, echoed behind me. I didn't need to look to know what it was. The animatronics were closing in. Bang! The door slammed open before I could even touch it, and there stood Fernandez. His face was pale, but his expression was calm, like he knew exactly what was happening, and that it was out of my hands now. Go, Daniel. You need to leave. His voice had a strange urgency to it, something I hadn't heard before. I hesitated. What about you? What about them? They'll stop for now, Fernandez said. But you need to get out of here. Fast. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't have the strength to. I just ran. The door slammed shut behind me, and for the first time since entering Zone 13, I could breathe. I don't know how long I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the security gates, where the familiar, comforting sight of the park's bright entrance lights welcomed me like a false promise. Everything looked so normal. People walking past, families laughing, tourists snapping photos. No one knew what had just happened. No one knew the nightmare I'd barely escaped. I stopped for a moment at the entrance, gasping for air, my pulse still racing. I felt like I was on the edge of falling apart, like the world around me wasn't real. Like the darkness I'd left behind was still following me. But I didn't have time to process it all. Fernandez's words echoed in my mind. The curse is spreading. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. I turned away from the gates, walking into the night. But even as I tried to put the park behind me, something nagged at the back of my mind, pulling at me. There was something in the air, something wrong. I glanced around, my heart skipping a beat as I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, moving in the distance. My breath hitched as I turned around and saw the park exit in the distance. The last thing I needed was to see that place again. But my eyes refused to look away as a chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw it. One of the animatronics. It was sitting in a parked car across the street, its face illuminated by the streetlights. Its eyes, those eyes, locked onto mine. And it grinned. I didn't wait to see if it would follow me. I couldn't. My legs carried me forward, and I never looked back again. But as I fled, the sound of its mechanical laughter echoed in my mind, and I realized I might never escape. Not truly. I didn't want to look back. I told myself I wouldn't. The road stretched before me, dark and endless, with only the occasional streetlight to break the night's thick blanket of darkness. But the feeling, the dread, it crawled up my spine, gnawing at me like some unseen thing, a presence I couldn't shake. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the cold air that rushed in through the cracked window. I hadn't even noticed how fast I was driving until I glanced down at the speedometer. I was well over the limit, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. Away from Disneyland. Away from Fernandez. Away from the cursed Zone 13. I had quit. I had left. That was supposed to be enough, right? But there was something in the air, something about tonight, that kept pulling me back. Like the park was still there, reaching for me, even though I was miles away. I turned onto a quieter street, the lights dimmer here, and I let out a shaky breath. I was free. The animatronics, the rules, Fernandez. Everything felt like it belonged to another life now, like a nightmare I had somehow woken from. But then, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just the usual reflection, the empty seat behind me, the dark road. But it didn't feel right. There was something off about the angle, something I couldn't quite place. I blinked, telling myself I was just exhausted, maybe seeing things after everything that had happened. Then I saw it, a figure, sitting in the back seat. My heart slammed against my chest. I sucked in a breath, trying to swallow the rising panic, but the air in the car suddenly felt thicker, colder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the mirror again, faster this time, my eyes wide, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't look away. The animatronic bear, the one I had seen in Zone 13, was sitting there, staring at me. Its eyes, those glassy, lifeless eyes, they weren't just still anymore. They were alive, watching me. And its smile, God, that smile, it stretched wider than it should have been able to. Too wide. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. But my heart didn't stop. My body didn't stop. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It felt like the car itself was suffocating me, like the world had closed in, leaving nothing but me and that grinning animatronic in the back seat. But when I whipped my head around to just look at it with my own two eyes, it was gone. I blinked. Hard. My chest heaved as I looked at the empty seat in the rearview mirror. Nothing. It was just a shadow in the corner of the car now, a trick of the light. I was losing it. I had to be. I was just so tired. The stress. The fear. It had to be messing with my head. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands trembling on the wheel. My breath came out in jagged bursts. My mind a storm of confusion and terror. But then I heard it. A faint humming. Soft, sweet, like a lullaby. It was coming from behind me. I didn't need to look to know what it was. The hairs on my neck stood up once more, my stomach dropping like a stone. The humming wasn't a lullaby. It wasn't Disney magic. It was something else. Something that had no business being in my car. And that's when I finally did what I had been trying not to do, what I had been terrified of all night. I looked. There it was. That same bear. Its red eyes were locked on me, its mouth stretching wider than humanly possible. Its voice, no longer just a simple hum, whispered softly into my ear, like it was right next to me. You're still part of the park, Daniel. You can't escape. My entire body froze. I couldn't move. The words sank into my bones, cold and heavy. The park. The curse. Fernandez. It was all real. This wasn't over. It was never over. The bear's grin grew even wider. You broke the rules. You'll always be ours now. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. All I could do was stare at it, frozen in that moment, trapped between my fear and the undeniable truth in its eyes. And then, just like that, the car's engine sputtered back to life. The lights flickered. The road stretched on, the same dark, empty road. And in the rearview mirror, the bear was gone. But I could feel it. I could feel it, just behind me, in the shadows. I wasn't free, and I never would be.